As Sandra mentioned, we launched into this year, for those of you who are coming in maybe just the recent weeks or today, we've launched into the book of Ephesians, but the theme of that is becoming who we are. Because here Paul really sets out to write to this community, and it was meant for the whole of communities to read, that this is what God has for us. This is our identity. And God's intent, His grand plan, the big scheme, if you pull back the curtain, is that we would know and rediscover who we really are through God's redeeming us through Christ, through the sacrifice of Christ and His identity upon us, and that we who were dead are now alive, we who didn't belong now belong. And then he reaches a point in this process of the letter where he says, and now this then is how you should live. So he wants us to know who we are, but then what does it mean then to begin to live right? And that's where, as we've seen, he begins to talk about the Spirit of God moving in such a way that we learn to live right among each other. And part of that is to submit to one another. There's a sense of, to put it in a different way, to honor mutually each other, so that we start to discover that this idea that there are some people who have power and some who don't, and all the power struggles that go on in life, that actually we begin to live with this right honor of each other. And so last week, as Joel shared, starts off with husbands and wives, and a somewhat more familiar text to many of, about husbands and wives really ultimately honoring each other. And now he takes up another relationship, and that's the relationship between child and parent. And he has a radical kind of subversive word to speak to us in that. And I don't know that there's really any relationship that is ultimately more powerful, more difficult, more sacred, but also more sensitive than that of child and parent. That's why so much of the hardest and best feelings we have in this room right now have to do with the relationship that you may have towards parents, or if you're a parent, maybe towards child. So powerful. And I want to draw out a song that many of you know, because you're old enough to remember it, or you've heard it even if you're younger. The song, very famous by Harry Chapin, Cats in the Cradle. A song that has caused more people to stop and think about this relationship of parent and child. And I'm going to ask us for just a moment to listen to the song. I'm not going to put images up on the screen, because I think we just need to let the storyline kind of speak to us. So let's listen up for a moment.
I'm gonna be like him, yeah. You know I'm gonna be like him. And the cats the cradle sisters little man. When you know that I don't know it, we'll get together there. You know we'll have a good time. Well, it came to college the other day, so much like a man just had to say something around you. Can you sit for a while? He shook his head and he said with a smile, I feel like daddy's all around. Sometimes my son's moved away. Call him up just the other day. I said I'd like to see you, if you don't mind. I said I'd love to dad if I can find time. You see some good jobs in the house with the kids in food, but it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung on the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And I can't see the silver little heart blue man. Beginning to know something I don't know when. Let me get the hand. We're gonna have a good time.
Anybody else a little teary? If not, we'll pray for you, because something's detached now. You know what God says at the end of the day? This song captures that struggle of the relationship between parent, especially father and child. And it turns out Harry Chapin's wife actually wrote that as a poem. And he wasn't interested in trying to write a song to it until his son was born. He went back to that poem and he wrote that song around that. And if you want to find yourself moved, go look at the comments people make in relationship to that song, because it just shows that there's this tension of bringing together what God's designed. And God said in the last days, one of the things he wants to do is that he would pour out his Spirit. And what would his Spirit do? It would turn the heart of children back to their fathers and fathers back to their sons. It's what God is wanting to do. It's what God wants to bring together in the right way. And I think he wants to do it right here today in this room. I hope some of you will kind of open yourself up to where you might find yourself on that journey and let God speak to you and offer up to God where you might be in that. Paul takes up now these words as he begins to speak to it in this particular letter. And so what we refer to as the 6th chapter of the book of Ephesians and the first 4 verses, he writes this, and you can follow on screen. You can see it there in your notes. He says, "Children, now obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." So he's talking kind of about how we need to have this sense of mutual honor to husbands and wives, now children, parents. We're going to look next week, and he says master slaves. It's kind of like the employment context, and he's really calling out the sense that there's this honor to be had. And in this child-parent relationship, some of you might think, well, this doesn't really relate to me because I'm not a parent. And maybe you start to kind of detach yourself from this because it seems to only be speaking to those that are parents. That's not true. Because everyone in this room is a child. Every one of us. So that means we all have a relationship with someone who in one form or another is a parent to us or has been a parent. There really are no test tube babies, by the way. Nobody creates life in a test tube. They just bring together the elements of life there. Every one of us ultimately has lives behind us, or we're meant to, and we're meant to be that connection. So it relates to all of us, and at the same time as it speaks to us as children, it speaks to parents, and we're all connected to parents. If you're not a parent yourself, you're in a community and you have friendships with those who are parents, and we're trying to figure it out with a culture that's trying to raise the next generation. So I believe this speaks to all of us here in these words. And he's saying here is that we're all really bound together with a third party, and that changes everything. Because the typical process of life when it comes to this whole child-parent thing, there's a lot of things we can learn about parenting, but at its core, at the root, is really that individuation. How do you take a life that is utterly dependent, totally dependent, and needs care, and how do you see it kind of emerge out into its own place in life? That's a hard process, and it comes with a lot of fighting. It comes with a lot of struggling for control. Individuation. Anyone been through it? I think you have. Everyone somehow individuates out and is trying to find their way, and it gets rough in that sense. And it leaves a lot of tough things in our hearts in that process. And what Paul's saying is, but now when God's in the equation, when there's a third party, we don't become just separate entities, parent, child. There's a sense in which we're bound together with an honor. And this is what it looks like. This is what it comes together. And he's being very radical and subversive here. I read these words and I think, yeah, they just sound like they're saying children obey parents and parents don't provoke. It doesn't sound very extreme. But it actually was so radical that it threatened the Roman Empire. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. You can kind of go look it up. The reasons, in part, that this new community of lives in the Apostle Paul was so threatening is because no one spoke of any value or rights to be honored by wives or children or servants. It was only husbands, men, and parents, fathers especially. They had all the authority. Absolute authority, in fact. They could decide whether you lived or not. And then masters. And so what Paul does is he's radically saying, no, there is a mutual, that when we discover God in the midst of us, we discover each other for who they really are and how we can honor them. And that it's not really trying to dismantle a good sense of healthy relationships. It's trying to bring God and blessing and back into it. And so that's what he's speaking here. So Paul's words now, speaking of husbands and wives, parents and children, is itself a radical call. But he begins here by speaking to children. And he begins by talking of them obeying and honoring their parents. And that's speaking to all of us, because all of us in this room relate to that. And he starts by saying this is all really centered in God. There's a place for this. You need to understand that the place of obeying and honor. And that's why he says, obey your parents unto the Lord. He kind of connects it to God. What does that mean? Well, at some level, it means that ideally the whole of the household would, in a sense, be connected with God, that we would all be living under the love and leadership of Christ in a home. And when Christ is kind of ruling that, it's God's blessing and God's grace running and ruling things and guiding us and teaching us, and that's all good. But it also speaks to when there's a sense in which something is not consistent with what God's will would be. And it implies, I think, that if a child is to obey their parents and it violates God, they would not do that. That they're following and obeying and learning from good wisdom from their parents, but not in contradiction of God, but actually unto or as unto the Lord. And so in no way is he saying to obey in such a way that one would try to hide abuse or do something that's really just wrong to do. What he's saying, though, is in general there is a rightness to this obeying of parents. And that's why he goes on to say, for it is right, he says. It is right. And what he means there is not like it's always right, but he's saying in general, this is part of the way the universe and creation runs. Obedience is one of the most natural parts of all of creation. It runs through it. It runs through the animal world. It runs through much of the created world. And it runs that children who have been created by two lives, who are mature and older and can provide for them, should obey and flow with that provision for them. And in that sense, it is right. It is the way God's designed it. He created us to be born to parents who can then raise us up. And so we should flow with that. We should give ourselves to it. We shouldn't fight that. It's not going to serve us well to do that. And that's why he goes on to note, and hey, it just kind of dawns on him, isn't this the one commandment that actually came with a promise? And that's what he notes here. It is. The fifth commandment, and this is the fifth of the 10 commandments, is to what? Honor father and mother. And here he unpacks, and it's the one that goes on to say something to the effect of, and if you do that, it will go well with you. Your life will be richer, and you will live longer for it. And again, that's not meant to be some kind of definitive rule or formula for life. It doesn't mean that if you obey parents that you will always live a long life, or someone who lives a short life didn't honor them. But it means, as a general principle, one's life is better. They're going to not have to make as many mistakes, and they won't have to suffer the consequences of those mistakes. They can gain and learn a lot from learning what their parents have to offer, what they understand. And if they can spend their whole lives, fighting off and kind of rebelling off, eventually that can have cost to it. I know it did in my own life. And I can see and appreciate what he's trying to say here, is that one should think about what they're fighting and see the value of obeying. And so he says that, and he goes, and now we have to ask, so what does it really mean then to obey and to honor? They're not exactly the same meaning, but he says, obey your parents, and then he says, and honor your father and mother, as the commandment says. And I think that we would say and understand that to obey a parent is related to honor, because if you don't obey an authority figure, you're not honoring them. It's generally deemed dishonorable. But they're not exactly the same in the sense that obedience, I would propose, is kind of the element of honor that's weighted at the formative season of life. When one becomes an adult, they're bearing that responsibility for life and therefore making life's decisions. And so obedience is something that is especially important as we're having to let somebody else's wisdom and perspective and responsibility, because they're responsible. We need to follow and flow with that. As we come into embracing our own responsibility, naturally we would have less of that sense of obeying. But the idea is that honor would carry out throughout life. Honor is something that continues. Honor is giving weight to something. The word honor literally means to give weight to something. And so the question is, do we give weight to that other person? Does it mean that much? See, there's a difference in weight. This is fairly light. This is a little bit heavier. Pretty different. I'm giving, this one right here has a sense of weight or substance. This, not at all. The question is, your parents, even if you're a grown adult child, even if your parents have passed away, one or both, do they carry weight in your life? Have you given them that place? Or are they something you blow off and just, you know what, I want nothing to do with them, I don't really care, to hell with them. There's a lot of people I know who feel that way, and I understand that. But here he's saying, honor, give weight. Children, give weight to your parents. And I know for some, if your parents are still alive, or one or both, we do well to ask ourselves, are we giving them that place and that space in our lives, that substance? Do we still care about them? Do we commit ourselves to being able to speak to them and encouraging them and making them significant in our life and in our world? Jesus is a great example to us in this, because we might think, Jesus and his parents, how was he example to that? Well, the truth is we see him kind of emerge at the age of 30, so he's well into what would have been considered adult years back then, way beyond that. And we see that he did not always obey his mom. His mom would call for some things, and he's like, no, I've got to be about my Father's business. But what we learn from him, a couple really important things. One is that we can disagree with somebody honorably, and we can disagree dishonorably. And a lot of us in this room need to really think about that. Because I know that some of us might feel like, my parents, their politics this, their lifestyles this, they're an alcoholic, they did this. And I just actually what I want to do is really make them feel it. I want to punish them almost. We can really dishonorably disagree. But we can also learn to disagree, and we're not under probably their control. We can really honor them and learn how to honor them rightly. We can say things to them. We can encourage them. We can say, I'm sorry we don't agree on this, but I really appreciate this about you. And a lot of us in this room need to learn how to do that. The other thing we see in Jesus, that even when he disagreed, he still honored his mother. His father, apparently Joseph, must have died early, which wouldn't be that unusual, because we see Jesus only with his mother later. And we see him right on the cross itself, as he is bearing the entire sins of all of humanity, past and future, us in this room, as that's happening. He looks down, and the last act he does is he looks down at his mother Mary and his closest disciple and friend John. And he makes sure that his mother's taken care of. He looks down and he says to Mary, Mother, this is now your son, speaking of John standing next to her. And then he says, John, this is now your mother. Meaning you now have the role to make sure that you do what I would have done, which is to provide for my mother the rest of her later years. He honors her. He never gave up. He always made sure he was committed and that she was not alone. She was taken care of. He included her in his life to the end. And some of us just need to hear that. He included his mother in his life until the end. We have to ask ourselves in this room, where are we in terms of really honoring, giving weight, giving substance to parents? And I know, I've just sat with people this morning. I'm constantly hearing people's stories. I know there's for a lot of people, it's like, you don't understand, my mother did this, my father did this, my dad walked out on us, my mom was an alcoholic, this and that happened. It really happens when you honor, is when you grow up and you get past relating to them merely as a provider or a punisher or any other role than as a person. And when you can see them in their humanity as a person, then you're able to start honoring them again for the person they are with all the faults. It doesn't mean there isn't a place for boundaries. It doesn't mean there isn't a place for thinking out a lot of things, but there's a place to honor them in their humanity. And I have seen people who chose to do it. I just was talking with somebody who said 10 years ago, right about exactly this time, they went and forgave their father and began to honor him and the blessing that flowed from that. And some of us I think this morning, God wants us to say, it's time for me to honor them. It's time for me to honor them. Now, some of us might say, well, one or both of my parents have passed on. Here's the thing. Here's good news. Honor doesn't die with the death of a life. Honor lives on. Even if your parent or a parent or both have passed on, you can still choose to now honor what maybe you have not been honoring in your heart. Honor is something it's a legacy. It's something that continues. So even some of us who've had them pass on can say, you know what? I have not lived with honor in my heart for them. It's time to find that right place for that. And then he goes on and brings this word to parents, and especially fathers, and that is to honor and train your children. And now that word to parents is to say that, do you grasp that children are a blessing? We've got to just kind of embrace and grasp that. Because a lot of our culture is kind of like using children as if they're kind of just for our egos, or we kind of need them to make us feel good, or we neglect them. We do all sorts of things, but we got to just stop and realize children are a blessing. Very expensive blessing, and a very complicated blessing, but they're a blessing. And beyond all the cost of time and money, beyond all of the complications they bring, they are a blessing. Blessing. To create life, to even be around friends who have created life. And I know for some that's hard because maybe you have wanted to, or you're not married and you haven't, but we're living that's the midst of a miracle. We should be going, wow. We should never stop going, wow, to the creation of life. We just shouldn't. Let's just all, wow. Can you just wow with me for a minute? Wow. Recreating life, it's pretty incredible. It's a blessing. Children are a blessing, but this is what Paul would remind us, that despite what some may say, children are a blessing that are also carry the same nature of defiance from God that we do. Or to put it in short terms, they're sinners just like the rest of us. Which means that I have to help raise them up with that disposition. Now, I know there's some who might believe, no, children have an innately, totally good and pure nature to them. And I'm glad to talk to you, but I can assure you, you're not a parent if you're thinking that right now, or almost sure, that's because I asked this a few months ago. We were talking about something else. I said, wait, tell me do you remember the moment when you taught your child to roll their eyes at you? Do you remember that day you taught them? When you taught them to throw that bottle in defiance, when you taught them to kind of fight you about your good sense about something that you were trying to teach them? You remember that? You don't remember it because it never happened. You never taught them. You don't have to teach them. They just know it. There's just that. I remember there's one mom, I heard she just kind of lost it, and she's like, son was just always defiant, and finally she said, all right, Jimmy, here it is. You can do anything you darn well please, and now I dare you to try to defy that. She's like saying, I'll tell you can do anything just so you can't defy it, you know. There just seems to be this kind of nature. It's trying to individuate, this power struggle that's constantly going on. And so a lot of what it's about is trying for us to realize that what we're needing to do is to help that this nature is not just going to merge. Some people say, oh, just create a great environment and let them become whoever they're going to be. Don't do that. Because I've met some of those people, and it's not, you know, we don't just emerge into this really kind of God-oriented nature in life. We just don't. What we really need is we need this sense of meeting God and knowing Him and having His Spirit and His nature work in us. What we are is like more like vessels. Every life like a vessel that has to navigate through life. And that vessel, that sailboat's trying to sail through life, it needs its sails up. And it needs a rudder. And it needs those two things. And that is why Paul says to us, he goes on to say this word to parents, fathers, do not exasperate your children, but rather, which means don't take the wind out of their sails. Don't take the wind out of their sails. But he goes on to say, but train them up and instruct them, which means what? Make sure that you're forming a rudder in their lives. Because those two things are going to be vital to forming through life, to making it through in life. So he says, don't exasperate your children. I love that word, exasperate, because I've never read it anywhere else. Like, I've never seen it. But I know what it means. Like, you know that? It's like I feel it. Come on, you know what I mean. It's like you're sitting going, I know what exasperate means, but I don't remember learning it. You just feel exasperated, right? When you felt it. And some of us in this room have felt exasperated by our own parents at times. Probably most of us at different times. There's just certain things that took the wind out of our sails that did not encourage us. And it says that really the meaning of this word exasperate, and more translations choose to just unpack it with this. Instead of exasperate, it says do not provoke to anger. Because that's the essence of it. Don't provoke them to anger. Now it doesn't say don't let your child be angry. Your child can choose to be angry. Children get angry over a whole lot of things, and you're not responsible, or I must make sure of that. But what about if you are? What about the things that we do that provoke or cause or bring out an anger? And it's really when a child doesn't feel that they're being honored in a way. They would never choose those words, but that's the essence of it. So he's saying honor them by making sure you're honoring them rather than provoking them. And there's a lot of things we can do to provoke a child's anger or to not really honor them. And I just list a number of them here. I'm going to just mention them really quickly here. And you can look them over, reflect upon them. But some of us as parents are realizing, these are the hard ones for me. This is what I tend to do. Some of you in this room, at some point you might go, yeah, I see that. That's one of the things my parent did, especially my father. Because I think fathers have a unique role, which if we had more time, I'd take it in. But there's a reason why I think he speaks here to fathers. But one of those, the first of those that I list here, is being overprotection. Overprotection. Young children obviously need protection. But as they emerge, they naturally are going to move out into more what? Freedom. So you start off with very little freedom. You can't, I don't want you even out of the crib or just lay. You start with a lot of protection, and you move towards less protection because a human life naturally wants to move out in freedom into the world. And when that's not granted, one is feeling like their own nature, that part of them that wants to be honored, the part that wants to be honored with freedom and with trust. There are those who are overprotected, and they do not feel that we as their parent trust them. And they feel that trust is due. And we'll fight over those things, but overprotection can really quench that. I know I oftentimes will say to my wife, honey, we got to let them do that, because do you remember when we were that age, what we did? That doesn't usually help. Because when I remind her what we did, it's like, yeah, I know what we did, and look what happened. And I'm like, oh yeah, forget that. But we do, but the truth is, we cannot ultimately just kind of create this sense of controlling freedom out. You can't take freedom out. It's there. It's there. You might scare you that it's there, but it's there. And total control is an illusion. So get over it and figure out how you emerge freedom, because that child will eventually feel angry trying to get through it. Another one is overindulgence. And it's found that in our day and age, with an overindulgence upon children, they're actually now the most angry generation of children are those who are overindulged. They have no idea how to navigate life internally and work in the real world. And so we've got to really look at how we can create a very frustrated creature if they're overindulged upon. Thirdly, favoritism. I was just praying for someone who said, my dad always said my sister was better than I am. Just always heard that. Why aren't you more like your sister? You know, when we're compared to somebody, eventually we're like, I give up. I'm so frustrated because I can't be who I'm not. I can't be somebody else. It's like our destiny was already settled. And maybe you've heard that. But for a lot of us, we have to be very careful. If we're going to honor children, we need to honor them and give them the right to be who they are and not under comparison. Fourthly, another that can cause anger is just basic neglect. Just being so busy that we're never at home, or when we're home, we're never involved. There are so many kids today who would say, you know what, I feel like my parents never put boundaries around me. There's just no boundaries. They didn't even seem to care where I was, or who I was with, or when I came home. And if they don't care, then I must not be that important. And you know what? If they don't care about boundaries, then maybe I shouldn't care about boundaries. And they will act out trying to find out, is anybody going to actually protect me and care for me? And there's an anger in life that will try to go out and push those edges. Fifthly, and similarly, lack of enjoying them. A lack of enjoying them. I think that kids, at some level, there's so much achievement and so much competition in life. I think sometimes kids want to know, I know you're focused on my grades, I know you're focused on my achievements, but are you ever focused just on me, where it's not about those things? Where I'm just enjoyed. That's hard. It's hard for some of us, because we are very focused on the achievements. But it wouldn't hurt for every dad to go to one like Princess Tea Party. You know, the Princess Tea Party, where, you know, you're on a little chair about this big, holding a little cup with a little tiara on. It wouldn't hurt to just have those moments where you're going, I can't believe I'm doing this. This is not exactly my thing, but I'm with the person that deserves to be enjoyed. And I'm going to learn to enjoy them. Not enjoy just the activities that I like. I'm going to enjoy their world. Stephen Covey, who wrote the book 7 Habits for Highly Successful People, talks of a friend whose young son got really into baseball. So that father took his son throughout one summer to see every single Major League Baseball team play. They traveled all over the States doing it. And afterwards, Covey said, he asked him, wow, do you like baseball that much? He said, I don't like baseball at all. I love my son that much. Some of us need to do things because we love the person that much. And get over whether it's about the activity or really enjoying them and being in their presence. Sixthly, unrealistic goals. A lot of us we can just get so achievement oriented that we just keep setting things too high. We think we're doing well by it, but we're really buying into a system more than we're loving our child. Seventhly, and related to that, is becoming overly critical. That's something that probably is at the root of what a lot of us feel or have felt or struggle with. I think the little boy, I've shared this before, who the teacher's asking the class, so, you know, what do you all want to be when you grow up? And one kid's like fireman, you know, one kid's like teacher, one kid's like doctor. And then little Billy answers, he goes, I want to be possible. She said, well, that's interesting. What do you mean by you want to be possible? He says, well, my mom always says I'm impossible. Poor kid. A lot of us feel like, I just want to be possible, you know, and because we've lived under this like constant, if you hear a word enough, it defines you. And it doesn't take hearing it that often. And a lot of us, we are just, I think, in just talking with people, I find that probably more of us are natural at being critically minded rather than encouraging. And especially men, and especially fathers. We tend to want to kind of bring that word of correction, that word of, hey, you really need to you could do this better. I want to help you do it better, so let me tell you how to do it better. And pretty soon, we're not really building up a life. We're becoming constantly critical. And we have, as you probably felt or you've known people where they see their parent coming and the parent says, I want to talk. And they think, oh no, what did I do now? That's the only thing they can imagine, because it's always that word of criticism. I was reading an article just a few months ago that was out in kind of this, the e-letters that were out and about, especially for parents involved with their kids in sports. And it was a really amazing article where they had done a lot of research on parents, how kids were feeling about their parents being at their sports and the conversations that would follow and flow from those game times or right after games. And it really challenged what parents talk about. And it was saying, right after game, you shouldn't be talking about how they played or getting very critical. They have a coach. And if you're not the coach, don't be the coach. Don't be the critic. And they said one line, this is the best thing you could say is just, I love watching you play. I used that line that day, and I've used it every weekend since. I just tell my kids in one way or another, I love watching you play. And I'm learning to love to watch them play. So that there's not that critical spirit where they're always feeling under evaluation. Because eventually, somebody gets tired of life being all about trying to prove it. And if a child is constantly trying to earn somebody's acceptance, they'll go find it in the arms of a boyfriend or girlfriend. They will continue to find it in ways you don't want. They need to know you. They have it. They don't have to earn it. And finally, and I would say, or flowing from that, is an excessive discipline or anger. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that a lot of us have experienced and deal with is that anger that gets out of control in the midst of that conflict and the frustration. And anger itself, the scriptures say, is not wrong in itself. But what it does speak of is uncontrolled anger. Anger that's not in control, that is self-serving, is wrong when it's serving our needs. And I would say this to you, whether it's about as a parent, as a marriage partner, as a friend. If you flow regularly and you kind of give freedom to be angry in such a way as that you want to do harm to another, it's not under control, and it's mean in nature, you are bringing something very destructive into your discipline, and you're bringing something very destructive into your relationships. And you need to really think about it, because there's some people who just, their anger is not in control. They give themselves permission to just kind of let loose on, again, children or spouse or others. And it is not under control. It wants to harm another, and it really is kind of mean in nature, will get sarcastic or worse. We really need to confront it. Because one of the things we found, and I know in my parenting, I've had times where I just lost it, and I'm realizing I am acting out and punishing in anger. Not cooling off, not giving the space, but in anger. Those are the times I had to go back and ask my kids for forgiveness. Those are the times I just thought, I don't ever get that one back. That was not good. What they experienced was not healthy, constructive discipline. And we need to think about that again in our marriages too, because here's what happens. If we prolong that kind of anger, if we're somebody who just constantly lets ourselves be angry and operate out of that, three things will get elicited. The first will be anger in response. Eventually someone starts saying, I'm angry back, and it just kind of escalates. The second thing, though, if we're the authority figure or we're the spouse who just keeps doing it, is apathy. Eventually someone says, you know what? I don't know what to do with your anger. You're always angry. And it just leads to apathy. And following apathy, alienation. Eventually, people just detach from somebody who always seems angry. And I say this out of care, but I think there's a lot of parents, even in their later years, and especially men, who are experiencing the alienation of kids who said, screw you. I dealt with your anger all my years. I'm gone. Dad, you just acted out, and I can't put up with that. Or Mom, you were an alcoholic. I'd come home, and one day you'd be happy, and one day you'd be horrible. You are not safe, and I'm done. And I want to say, that alienation that eventually comes, we need to make right by it. And the last point is that, which is that One thing we need to learn, and is one of the problems can be a lack of humility and repentance, that lack of the ability to say I was wrong. And I think for a lot of us, part of this is that need to be able to say, wow, I blew it. And that could be as simple as, I came in on you and your brother or sister fighting. I thought you were the one in the wrong, and I jumped on you, and I realized now it really wasn't. When I got the bigger picture, I was wrong. Or I thought I had the right answer and you had the wrong. Actually, it turns out you were right. I kind of jumped to some conclusions. Even that, we need to be able to say I'm wrong. Some of us really need to learn how to be wrong. We really need to learn how to be wrong. Because eventually, this is what a child will eventually learn, is that they're not as important as a father's ego or a mother's pride. And there's a lot of kids who think, you know what? My dad could do anything and he would never admit he's wrong. Which means that his ego is more important than me. He made me feel bad, and he knew he was wrong at some point. I figured out he must have known he was wrong, but he'd never say he's sorry, which meant he would let me have to face what I felt so that he could keep his ego. Well, I know what's more important. Or mom's pride. Mom would never come back around. She would dismiss it. Oh, yeah, okay, maybe I was wrong. Don't worry about it. Oh, my gosh, it was a big deal. Don't dismiss and downplay what I face because of your errors. We need to learn to say, I was wrong. And here's the truth. We do not need children to have us always be right. We need to help them to understand that God is always right. And sometimes that means we have to say we were wrong. We need to lead them into the reality that God is always right. That's the place to take them. We need that kind of humility. And now he goes on after saying all of these things. Now go on. He says, don't exasperate your children. Don't do the things that take the wind out of their sails. Or don't let them even hoist up their sails. But make sure you let them raise their sails. Don't exasperate them. Don't provoke them to anger. Keep it up. But you also have to build a rudder. And he closes, and I won't expand on this, but he closes by then saying, so therefore, instead of that, do this. Build that rudder by bringing them up, meaning nurturing them, and training them, which means disciplining them. There's a place for discipline. We have to be proactively involved. None of this kind of passive we'll see. There's a place to really discipline. And I'm not going to try to, again, expand on the specifics of that. But it's kind of like we need to build some wedges in their life. When I was praying for my son about a year ago, we were praying for school. And God just showed me these kind of wedges where you just have like a boundary, where if the ball was to move down like in a pinball machine, it hits the wedges and it directs it some. And there was a need for that in his life. And God's so blessed what that led to. We just made choices that helped that. But every day, I need to ask, am I creating, am I training, am I giving some direction by word, by modeling, that somehow lets them know that there is a rudder, there is something that can steer and direct their lives into good things. And that ultimately it says, bringing instruction in the Lord, that the good thing is in God, not in you, and not in conventional morality. Please do not raise moral kids. We do not need moral kids. They become very dangerous in a certain way. I know that sounds strange. But there is a difference between trying to raise some morally respectable kid so you can feel good about yourself or something, and raising kids who know God. Because at the end of the day, what we really need is to know God and His grace and His guidance, which is unchanging, which is a living connection, not just to try to rules that are ever changing, but that living connection. So he says, give instructions unto the Lord. So yes, there's instructions and yes, there's guidance, but it is in relationship to God. God's Spirit, as Paul understood, God's Spirit poured out on the earth, which He now has, is wanting to direct fathers back to their children and children back to their fathers. And I think this morning, I think for a lot of us, we really want to avoid the parent relationship. We don't even want to think about it sometimes. I meet a lot of people, it's like, ooh, that's a hard place to go. Just a hard place. I could talk about just about anything more comfortably. And I can talk about my parents at this level. But if I'm going down, it gets kind of hard. The truth is, but God's there. God is there. Your parents are not the end all of your life. They are mediators of God. And that's why you and I can go there. And I want to ask you this morning, some of us, some of us this is a time to say, you know what, I need to re-honor my parents. I didn't. In my journey, I decided, I can remember when I stopped honoring them. In fact, I decided I'm going to make sure I'm not going to honor them. Or maybe just by neglect I didn't. I got so into myself, and I feel the tension. A lot of us out on the west side, a lot of us have moved here and kind of parents are far away. And we're struggling. Some in this room, your parents have, again, passed, but you still have that choice to make. Do I choose now to place honor in my heart? Can I forgive them and find and honor what is good? I'm going to invite you in a minute. I just want to invite some of us to say this morning, I just want to come back and give that one to the altar. I want to give my dishonor and put it on the altar and take up the place of honoring my mother and father in this world. Or maybe it's a grandparent. And I want to say to you who are parents, or I want to say to also all of us that maybe you realize that you had your sail quenched. Maybe you were exasperated. Maybe you identify with some of these dynamics that do that. I want to invite you to come in a moment, and I just want to have you come to the altar and just bring that to God. And then as we're able, some of us will pray for you, but it's really about you bringing that. And lastly, for those who realize as a parent, boy, I'm struggling with that one. I just really realize I need to bring that to God. I want to invite you to come. And so I want to invite us to stand. If you would stand with me, but I'm going to ask you to make, just to do what you need to do with God. But I want to encourage you to come on down and let this be an altar as we sing the song. Let it be an altar. Some of us need to kind of join what God wants to do in our lives. So I invite you to come down as we sing this song, and then as we're able, we're just going to pray over you, and then we'll close.